So the fourth responsibility that is the board chair can lead the way, but really does require everyone on the board, is to really stay focused on financial oversight and legal compliance. On the financial oversight, obviously you have a budget, that comes from somewhere, but making sure you really sort of do look at that periodically and share that with the full board, and that you and the treasurer of the board can really sort of explain the numbers in a way that makes sense. It doesn't mean you have to do line items all the time, but it's sort of are we spending what we thought we'd spend? What's up? What's down? We know where those things stand at the moment on the investment side, but even on the budget. Again, making sure those financial reports go out. You know, there's no excuse in this day and age for financial reports not getting to board members. And that doesn't mean that you should, and I think this is something that no matter what's on your agenda, there should be a good 5 to 10 minutes on every board meeting agenda that says where's our money? Where's it coming from and where's it going, just so everyone is aware of that. You don't ever want to be asleep at the switch. Those are the embarrassing conversations in the community, which is what happened. How did you not know your CEO was getting paid that much, or things like that. I think foundations and audits, I think most of you do audits. Again, there's just too many issues about misuse of money and questionable practices that you want to make sure that you have an audit done, an independent audit, and that it's sort of shared with the full board, not just with the CEO, not just with the board chair, but with the full board. And that you have a really good investment strategy, especially now, and it's sort of really it's very hard to get out of the crisis of the moment, but foundations are long-term. You can weather this. You may not personally be here for all of it, but to sort of realize that this is a long-term issue and opportunity as much as it is a challenge. So again, as board chair, you run the meetings. So part of that is really thinking ahead about planning agendas, not just sort of waiting and showing up and here's a bunch of papers and we're going to run through them, but really sort of thinking about what's the right balance, how do you spend your time, and sending out materials in advance, which also presumes that the people on your board will read them in advance. And so sort of making that possible. Obviously, your second big responsibility is to lead and facilitate the meeting. And I don't know if it was someone here or somewhere else where I said that, to me, board chairs are not making the decisions. They're facilitating the decision-making process. And sometimes that's hard to forget. It's easy to forget when you're either caught up in an issue or want to move on and be really efficient. But sort of board work is fundamentally democratic, and it's not always designed to be efficient, but you end up with better decisions. So your job is to make sure that there is a process and way of getting to a conclusion, and that it does happen in a timely way, but it's not just to make the decision and sort of pound the gavel and move on. And lastly, probably the hardest part about being board chair is dealing with those difficult board members, whether they're someone else from the community who doesn't understand it, whether it's a family member who is acting out on other issues, sort of finding a way to be a diplomatic team leader, facilitator, and call them out on it, whether it's calling a halt to the meeting, whether it's talking to them after the meeting, but sort of really almost no one else can rein in a difficult board member except the board chair or another really strong board member who sees it happening and can help. But again, people sort of look to the board chair to sort of lead that process. In my mind, most board chairs sit ex officio on every committee because as I go back to my slide, the board chair's job is to make sure all the committees are connecting where they need to connect. So if, for example, you are making grant making in a certain area and you realize you need expertise in environmental issues and you want to create an advisory committee, you can think about who's on the board that could be part of that. You might think about who's in the community, but that also would tie into maybe a grant committee that's focused on environmental issues. And so the board chair is the one person besides any staff you have that are going to be able to connect those dots and sort of make sure that, gee, maybe these two committees need to get together. Maybe they share a common agenda item or a common goal for the year. The seventh responsibility, I know it's a long list for the board chair, is to make sure that you have a strong and engaged board. So this is where that governance committee comes in handy. But again, the board chair is sometimes the one who makes the, if not only meaningful invitation, but the symbolic invitation to someone to join the board. But really sort of making sure that you pay attention to your board composition. One of the ways that you really can build a strong board is to delegate this. It may be to one individual who just happens to have an aptitude for this, but to be clear about it, but you can sort of share these responsibilities. You don't have to do it yourself. I mean, that's what a good manager does, and in some ways the board chair really is the manager of the board. We've touched a little bit on communicating with the community. Again, as the foundation board chair, you're often the public spokesperson or seen as the spokesperson for the foundation. Your CEO or executive director may also be doing a lot of that, but to realize that there are times when the foundation board chair needs to be the one that's out in front in the public. And it often begins with just sort of one is letting people know what your foundation does, who you are, how you work, and just networking in your own nice, neat little circles. Thinking about the larger community and who is a designated spokesperson for what issues. So when there's a question about CEO compensation, don't make your CEO answer that. That's a board chair or a committee chair responsibility. And lastly, there's a movement in the philanthropy field to really sort of figure out what is your relationship with grantees and how do you really sort of interact with them and have open communications and a mutual respect there. We talked about that at the beginning of the session, but really getting input from your grantees and other grant seekers so that you know how you're perceived in the community, not what you'd like to project, but what they think about you. So to really sort of pay attention to that and work with other grant makers. So board chairs, unfortunately, you also do have the job of sort of, short of having your poor executive director report to everybody on the board, trying to oversee the administrative work and sort of be a focal point for making sure things that get done. I think of this job as, you know, again, sort of, you are the sort of, it's always easy for one person to have a manager. Or if you have to manage a bunch of volunteer board members or board members who are doing certain tasks, they need one person they can go to with their questions, and that sort of often falls on the board chair. And so part of that is just making sure everyone knows what their job is, whether it's a committee chair or a board member who's taking on executive compensation research, or whether it's the CEO who's got to sort of keep the office going, making sure everyone knows what their job is, first of all, and then finding a good way to work together, sort of really building a good collaborative working relationship. If you do have an executive director, the board chair is often the one that sort of does the literal one-on-one, hands-on hiring and firing. Hopefully you don't have to do the firing, but you know, sort of keeping track of those things and sort of realizing that you have to sort of, you wear a supervisory hat in that capacity on behalf of the board. The board chair can often lead the way. It doesn't have to be the board chair, it could be other board members, but making sure that there's a way to assess performance. And so this is assessing performance of the CEO if you have a staff member, and finding a way to do that on an annual basis that then also ties into compensation review. Again, these are things that a lot of other people are paying attention to, and we can talk about how that works in a minute. But also periodically assessing performance of the board, whether it's in a formal annual retreat. BoardSource, the National Center for Family Philanthropy, have self-assessment tools for boards that are geared towards either families or community foundations or private foundations. So there are tools out there. There's a lot of others as well. But sort of finding some way to reflect on how you're doing, because otherwise you're going to probably be stuck in the same old problems. And it's amazing. As a consultant, the most effective way I've seen boards get out of ruts is to spend time saying, this is what we're doing well. Here's our 10 areas of responsibility. Here's what we're not doing well. And it's a lot easier to make change when the feedback comes from your board members, not from an outside person or a board chair saying, this is what we need to do differently. And you find out what people are really thinking. And even those people that you think are telling you everything they're thinking may, on reflection, have some really productive ways to do it, and those that don't say anything may have some really great insights. So using a self-assessment to sort of really direct board work can be helpful. The other thing that's becoming a growing trend in the foundation world is really assessing your impact in the community. You know, now that you've been giving away money for 10 years, how do you know you've made a difference? You know, how many homeless people have been sheltered? How many hungry people have been fed, how many parks have been built, whatever it is you can begin to document your impact. Helps that accountability on the public side. It helps your board members feel better about knowing that what you're doing and how you're doing it, and that it makes a difference. And I think it's also sort of just reaffirming for board members that feel like, wow, this really did matter. You know, and it may seem like a drop in the bucket, but being able to sort of tell that difference. So I will ask you to pause and reflect on this as you spend the rest of the afternoon sort of here, which is to really think about the best boards you've ever sat on, whether it's your foundation or others, and the worst. And you as board chairs have a chance to set the tone and model those best practices. You don't have to do all of them tomorrow, but really pick a few that are going to make a difference for the next year and sort of stick to them, because it's that kind of focused intentionality that will start to turn things and make them work better, and you'll have more fun, your board members will be happier, and our communities will be better.